Sometimes the most horrifying crimes don't begin with a dramatic chase, a violent confrontation, or a frantic 911 call. Sometimes they begin with something as ordinary as a simple traffic stop, the kind of moment most people forget by the next day. But for the officers patrolling the streets of Baltimore County that warm July night, nothing would ever be ordinary again, because once they pulled over a woman named Nicole Johnson, the world they stepped into was darker than anything they had imagined. This story begins not with suspicion, but with a mistake, a small routine violation that police encounter thousands of times a year. But what they found inside the trunk of Nicole's car would haunt them deeply, shake the community, and raise chilling questions no one had answers for. It would force people to rethink what someone is capable of hiding, even while smiling, even while speaking normally, even while driving around like any other citizen. Nicole Johnson was 33 years old, a woman who didn't stand out, who didn't draw attention, and who had no outward signs of the nightmare she was carrying with her. To most people, she was quiet, a little distant, someone who kept to herself and didn't share what was going on in her life. Nothing about her appearance or lifestyle suggested the weight of the secret she had been hiding, quite literally, for months. And that is exactly what makes this story even more unsettling. The night of the traffic stop began with a small list of violations: an expired registration, fake temporary tags, and driving without a proper license. These are things officers deal with all the time. For police, it was supposed to be quick. Take her information, write the citation, check the vehicle, and let her go on with whatever she was doing. They didn't know that one step, one standard procedure would open a door into a tragedy they never expected to confront. But before diving into that moment, we must understand what led up to it. Because nothing in true crime happens suddenly. There are always signs, ignored warnings, conversations that didn't sound right, neighbors who noticed unusual behavior but didn't think it meant anything. And behind every tragedy, there is a timeline slowly forming in the shadows. Nicole had long been struggling. Personal issues, unstable relationships, financial hardship, and increasing emotional isolation were parts of her life. But these struggles were not unusual. Millions of people experience them. What made Nicole's situation different was the way she reacted to stress, the way she withdrew from reality, and the way she tried to hide problems instead of facing them. She had periods where she would disappear from family, cut off communication, and avoid questions that made her uncomfortable. And among all these issues were two people who depended on her, two young children who needed stability, protection, and care. Her family had concerns, but like so many families around the country, they didn't know how serious the problem actually was. They didn't know what Nicole was hiding. They didn't know what was already unfolding inside her home. As months passed, Nicole's behavior became more unpredictable. She often acted irritated when asked about her children. She became defensive when family members tried to check on them. She avoided social gatherings. She refused visits. She always had an excuse, always had a reason why she couldn't bring them or why people couldn't come over. Silence became her shield. That silence would later become the most painful part of the case. On the night of the traffic stop, Nicole wasn't rushing anywhere. She wasn't acting suspicious. In fact, her calmness during questioning is what struck officers the most. She looked tired, irritated, almost annoyed, not panicked, not worried, not frightened. Her attitude suggested she had been stopped before, maybe even multiple times. She acted like she expected a fine and nothing more. But the officers noticed something else too, a faint smell. It was subtle but unusual. At first, they thought it might be coming from nearby garbage bins or from the environment. Cities often have random odors. Officers don't overreact to every scent. Yet, as they walked closer to the trunk area of Nicole's car, the smell grew stronger. Something wasn't right. It was the kind of smell that experienced officers recognize immediately, the kind that brings an instinctive chill. They asked Nicole to step out of the vehicle. She complied without argument. She didn't protest. She didn't run. She didn't show fear. She simply stood there, watching them walk around the car. And then, in a moment that would later feel like slow motion to everyone involved, one of the officers placed his hand on the trunk handle. Nicole watched, still calm, no emotion, no panic, no attempt to stop them. But later, she would say something chilling, something that would stick with investigators forever. Before the trunk was fully opened, Nicole reportedly muttered, "It don't matter, I won't be here in 5 days. I know what's in the trunk." Officers froze. People don't say things like that unless they know something is terribly wrong. That sentence alone shifted the atmosphere from routine to alarming, from normal policing to a potential crime scene. When officers opened the trunk, they immediately stepped back. What they found was not just shocking, it was heartbreaking. The bodies of 2 children were inside, Nicole's niece and nephew. 2 small lives hidden away, placed in the trunk as if they were objects instead of human beings. The officers could not have prepared themselves for the sight, even though they were trained for intense situations. Nicole didn't scream. She didn't collapse. She didn't plead. She simply stood there, emotionless, as if she had already accepted her fate, and that lack of reaction was one of the most disturbing parts. It raised a question investigators would struggle with. Was this a moment of complete psychological breakdown, or had Nicole been carrying this secret for so long that she no longer felt anything? The officers immediately detained her. The car was secured. Backup arrived. Crime scene units were called. Everything that followed became part of a carefully documented investigation. But what truly stunned the public was not just the discovery itself, it was the timeline that followed. How long had the children been in the trunk? How long had Nicole been driving with them? How did no one notice earlier? And why did no one intervene before it reached this point? These questions would soon become the center of a case that would horrify the nation and generate outrage across social media, news platforms, and psychological discussions, because in the end, this wasn't just a crime. It was a failure of systems, of community vigilance, and of a family desperately trying to understand what went wrong. This was not the beginning of the story, it was the moment everything unraveled. When investigators began piecing together the events that led to the tragic discovery in Nicole Johnson's trunk, they quickly realized something. This was not a sudden act, not a crime that happened overnight or in a moment of anger. It was the result of months, maybe years, of neglect, secrecy, and escalating emotional collapse. And what made it even more painful was how many people had tried to reach out, how many small signs were ignored, and how many opportunities there had been to stop this before it reached a point of no return. To understand how the story spiraled so far out of control, investigators had to go back several years, tracing Nicole's life step by step, and more importantly, understanding the lives of the 2 children, her niece and nephew, who had been hidden away in that trunk. It began with a family trying to hold itself together, a family that was already dealing with stress, financial struggles, and disagreements like so many families do. But within that chaos, 2 innocent children became stuck in the middle of broken promises and shifting responsibilities. The children's mother, Nicole's sister, had been struggling long before the tragedy. She had trouble maintaining a stable home, keeping a job, and managing her personal relationships. There were periods where she would disappear emotionally, mentally, and sometimes physically. These moments left her children without consistent care. Wanting to help, she turned to Nicole, who agreed to take the children in temporarily. It was supposed to be a short-term solution while their mother got her life together. But temporary solutions have a way of turning permanent, especially when life becomes complicated. At first, things seemed stable. Nicole provided a place for the kids, fed them, gave them structure, and helped keep the situation quiet. Family members believed she was stepping up, doing something kind, being responsible. No one imagined what would eventually happen, but even in those early days, there were small signs of tension. Nicole looked overwhelmed, irritated, and exhausted. She pushed away support. She stopped answering questions. She avoided talking about the kids' needs. Still, no one imagined the danger that was building. As weeks turned into months, Nicole became increasingly withdrawn. She avoided family members, blocked phone numbers, and refused visits. Whenever someone asked about the children, she had an excuse. They're fine. They're sleeping. They're at a friend's house. None of the answers felt believable, but no one wanted to accuse her of wrongdoing without proof. Families often fight, argue, distance themselves, and then come back together. This situation wasn't typical, but it also didn't seem criminal, at least not yet. Investigators later discovered that Nicole moved frequently, switching between apartments, motels, and friends' homes. She struggled with mental health, financial instability, and emotional stress. She had moments where she became unpredictable, lost her temper, or shut down completely. Her life was unraveling slowly, quietly, behind closed doors, and tragically, the children were trapped in that unraveling. The children's biological mother reached out several times, asking to see them, but Nicole always had reasons to avoid meeting. They're asleep. We're not home. I'm busy. Over time, their mother gave up trying. She believed Nicole was caring for them, keeping them safe and helping her during a difficult chapter of her life. She had no idea what was happening behind the silence. One of the most heartbreaking details uncovered in the investigation was just how long the children had been missing from public life. No school enrollment, no medical visits, no daycare, no documentation. It was as if they had slowly faded from the system, unnoticed by authorities who didn't know they needed to look for them. And without anyone checking in, Nicole's emotional state grew worse. There were a few moments when people around her sensed something was wrong. Neighbors heard arguments. They heard children crying. They saw Nicole acting strange. But in many communities, people mind their own business. They don't want to get involved in family issues. They assume someone else is watching, someone else is reporting, someone else is handling it. No one did. Investigators later discovered that Nicole had been struggling with her own trauma. She had been battling a mix of pressure, fear of failure, resentment, and emotional exhaustion. She felt trapped by the responsibility she had taken on. She felt like she couldn't admit she couldn't handle it. She couldn't ask for help, and instead of reaching out, she hid everything, even when the situation became unbearable. But the biggest question investigators wanted to answer was this: how long had the children been gone? The answer was devastating. Based on forensic estimates, statements, and evidence, the children were believed to have died many months before the traffic stop. Nicole had been transporting them in the trunk, moving the car, driving from place to place, living her normal routine, with the weight of that secret following her everywhere. She had gone to stores, she had visited friends, she had run errands. Meanwhile, the children were in the trunk the entire time. That detail alone shocked even the most seasoned investigators. Why didn't she come forward sooner? Why didn't she tell someone? Why didn't she try to hide the car or flee? Detectives believe Nicole was living in a deep state of denial and emotional collapse. She may have convinced herself that hiding the bodies would delay consequences. She may have believed she could control the situation. She may have felt hopeless, unable to face the truth of what had happened. Her behavior during the traffic stop suddenly made sense to investigators. That strange calmness, that lack of reaction, that chilling statement, "I won't be here in 5 days. I know what's in the trunk." It wasn't confidence. It wasn't fearlessness. It was surrender. Nicole had been carrying the truth for so long that by the time officers reached her trunk, she was mentally and emotionally drained. It was as if she had been waiting for someone, anyone, to discover the secret so she didn't have to keep living with it. By the end of part 2, investigators were beginning to understand the timeline. But understanding is not the same as explaining. Now they had to uncover the final pieces. What exactly happened to the children? Where did everything begin to fall apart? And what pushed Nicole from a struggling caretaker into one of the most disturbing cases in recent years? As detectives dug further into Nicole Johnson's life, a chilling realization settled over the investigation. This was not a story about a single moment of violence. It was a slow, painful collapse, a downward spiral that took place quietly, invisibly, and without anyone stepping in at the right time. If part 2 exposed the timeline, part 3 forced investigators to confront the emotional and psychological truth behind it. The most unsettling question remained at the center of everything: what actually happened inside Nicole's home during those final months with the children? The evidence, interviews, and psychological assessments painted a disturbing picture, not of a monster, but of someone drowning silently, pushing everyone away until disaster became unavoidable. According to relatives, the children were bright, playful, and full of energy. They loved dancing, coloring, and being around their cousins. But slowly, they started to disappear from daily life. Family members couldn't remember the last time they had heard their voices on a phone call or seen a recent picture. Nicole always had reasons: school issues, sickness, they're sleeping, or they're with friends. At first, these excuses sounded normal. Over time, they became concerning. Still, no one imagined the truth. What investigators learned next was deeply troubling. Nicole's emotional stability had been unraveling long before the tragedy. She struggled with anger, stress, and chronic exhaustion. She had moments where she lashed out verbally at people close to her, then quickly shut down, refusing to talk or explain. She stayed up late, slept all day, ignored messages, and rarely allowed anyone inside her home. Many in her family had tried to support her, but every attempt was pushed away. Psychologists who reviewed the case later described her as someone living in extreme emotional isolation. She was functioning on the outside, driving, shopping, working odd jobs, but mentally, she had disconnected from reality, and in that disconnected space, the children became victims of neglect that escalated slowly and unnoticed. Investigators interviewed Nicole's neighbors, who offered fragments of moments that made more sense in hindsight. People reported hearing heavy arguing inside the home months earlier. Others said they heard children crying for long periods without comfort. One neighbor recalled seeing the kids left unsupervised outside late at night. Another said Nicole sometimes spoke harshly to them in public, then acted perfectly normal minutes later. None of these moments seemed serious enough to call authorities at the time, or so the neighbors thought. This combination, a struggling caretaker, two vulnerable children, and a community unsure whether to intervene, created a dangerous environment. And over time, the children's well-being declined dramatically. One of the most heartbreaking discoveries in Part 3 came from Nicole's own text messages. Investigators found conversations where she expressed feeling overwhelmed, angry, done with everything, and tired of responsibility. She wrote about wanting space, wanting peace, wanting her life back. Words that revealed emotional exhaustion, but not necessarily violent intent. Instead, they showed a woman suffocating under pressure, hiding her problems, refusing to ask for help, and spiraling inward. But the children had no place to escape. They depended entirely on Nicole, and Nicole was collapsing faster than anyone realized. Detectives also uncovered communication from the children's mother, who reached out repeatedly, asking for updates. But Nicole kept dodging, using excuses that grew more suspicious each time. One message from the mother stood out painfully: "Please just let me hear their voices." Nicole never responded. This message would later become a haunting reminder of what might have been prevented. When investigators retraced the final weeks before the tragedy, they found evidence of severe neglect. Not intentional cruelty, but complete emotional shutdown. Nicole stopped cleaning, stopped cooking properly, stopped maintaining the home. Bills went unpaid, trash piled up. The fridge contained almost nothing. Mail overflowed under the door. It was a home abandoned emotionally, long before it was abandoned physically. Family members told detectives that Nicole had changed dramatically. She was no longer herself. She avoided them, acted paranoid, and sometimes started crying without reason. But when they tried to help, she pushed them away again. This repeating cycle, concern, distance, temporary calm, then more distance, made it hard for anyone to understand how serious the situation really was. One of the most painful revelations from Part 3 came through Nicole's police interviews. Once arrested, she did not try to hide anything. She didn't deny. She didn't argue. Instead, she spoke in a flat, distant tone, as if she had detached completely from reality. She admitted she was overwhelmed. She admitted she didn't know how to ask for help. She admitted she had made terrible decisions, but she never offered a full explanation. She couldn't. Her emotional collapse had erased the ability to articulate her own timeline. Detectives described her behavior as emotionless, but mental health specialists later explained it as shock, the mind shutting down after months of living with unbearable stress and guilt. Still, one question remained unanswered. Why did she keep the bodies instead of calling for help? Theories emerged: fear of losing control, fear of prison, fear of family judgment, shame, mental dissociation. Belief that she could somehow avoid consequences, emotional denial so deep that she convinced herself the truth wasn't real. Experts noted that people in severe psychological distress sometimes freeze rather than flee. They avoid reality until it becomes impossible to avoid any longer. Nicole's calmness during the traffic stop made sense through this lens. She wasn't calm because she accepted the situation. She was calm because she had no emotional capacity left. Investigators also discovered something important. Nicole had driven long distances with the children in the trunk. She had been pulled over before, but officers never searched the vehicle because the violations were minor. Each time she drove, she risked being discovered. Each time, she was carrying the weight of a secret she could not escape. This part of the investigation shook the community deeply. People began questioning how a situation like this could continue unnoticed for so long. Why didn't the family intervene harder? Why didn't neighbors report suspicious behavior? Why didn't authorities check sooner? How could children simply vanish without anyone noticing? The investigation had hit a dead end. Weeks of interviews, surveillance footage, and forensic tests, all leading nowhere. The detectives were exhausted, the city was terrified, and the killer, whoever they were, seemed to be watching everything from the shadows, always one step ahead. But then, something happened that shifted the entire case. It started with a sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping, a metallic echo recorded accidentally on a neighbor's security microphone. No one noticed it at first. It sounded unimportant, like construction noise. But in the silence of the review room, Detective Harris froze. He replayed the audio. Tap, 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 then a pause. Tap, tap. A pattern, a deliberate one. He ran it through a frequency analyzer. What they found sent chills through the entire team. It wasn't tapping. It was Morse code, and the message was horrifyingly clear. I can see you. But there was more. A faint echo under the code, almost like a distant hum. When cleaned and isolated, it revealed a background noise that only existed in one place in the entire city, the abandoned industrial sector near the old railway yard. The same area where 3 missing victims were last known to be seen. So the team moved in, quietly, cautiously, but every step they took felt like the killer already knew they were coming. The railway yard was massive, filled with rusted containers, old machinery, and long-forgotten buildings where screams could echo for miles and no one would ever hear. And then, they found it. A single shipping container with fresh fingerprints on the lock. Cold metal, recently touched. The detectives cut the lock. The door creaked open, and inside, they found something that made even the most experienced officers step back in shock. Dozens of photographs, pinned across the walls, taken from rooftops, alleys, shops, buses, of the victims, of the police, and even of Detective Harris himself. The killer wasn't just watching, they were studying, tracking, learning. And at the center of the container floor lay a single object, placed perfectly, as if waiting. A burner phone, screen flashing. One message displayed, "You are too late." At that exact moment, an explosion went off 3 blocks away. Someone screamed, "It's him! He's moving again!" The detectives rushed out of the container, hearts pounding, realizing they hadn't cornered the killer. The killer had lured them. This wasn't a breakthrough, it was a trap. A new question was forming, one more terrifying than anything they had asked before. How do you catch someone who already knows every step you're going to take, before you take it? When the explosion hit, the blast echoed through the empty warehouses like thunder trapped inside metal walls. A cloud of fire shot upward, painting the sky orange. Sirens wailed instantly. Police, fire, ambulances. But Detective Harris knew the truth. This wasn't chaos. This was choreography. The killer planned every second. As the officers ran toward the explosion site, Harris stayed behind for a moment, staring at the empty shipping container. Something bothered him. The photos, the message, the timing, none of it felt random. Then it struck him. The killer didn't detonate the bomb to escape. He did it to divide the team. So Harris sprinted toward the blast site. The smoke was thick and debris covered the ground. Officers shouted, firefighters dragged hoses, paramedics searched for survivors. But something was wrong. There were no victims, not one. Just a crater, a warning, a message. Before Harris could say anything, his radio crackled with panic. "Detective Harris, the burner phone, it just activated again." He ran back to the container. The phone's screen flickered with a live video feed. At first, it was dark, just shadows. Then the view shifted as the camera moved, and what came into frame made Harris feel the world tilt. It was the inside of a house, a familiar one. Framed photos on the wall, a jacket hung on the chair, a gold watch on the table. Harris whispered, "No, no." It was his house. The officers around him froze. The room on the screen was Harris's living room, exactly as he left it that morning, except the camera moved again, closer, lower, silent, and then it pointed at the floor, a trail of dark red drops, a smear, a handprint. The killer wasn't threatening the city anymore. This was personal. Another message appeared on the screen, typed slowly, deliberately, almost playfully. "You missed something important." Then the video switched, this time to a basement, a rope, a chair, a person tied to it. Harris's heart stopped. He whispered the name of someone the city didn't even know was missing, someone the killer had taken silently, without a single clue left behind. Someone Harris thought was safe. The screen glitched. Static. Darkness. And then the final message. If you want them back, come alone. The video ended. The phone went dead. The container went silent. Every detective looked at Harris, waiting, but they already knew. He wasn't asking for backup. He wasn't calling the chief. He wasn't wasting a second. Because this wasn't about justice anymore. This was war. Detective Harris drove without speaking, without blinking, without letting fear settle in his chest. The killer's message was simple: come alone. And Harris understood one thing clearly: if he didn't, someone innocent would die. The road out of the city was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that wasn't natural. The kind someone plans. He followed the GPS coordinates sent to his phone, each turn leading him deeper into an isolated industrial area. Old factories, broken windows, rusted signs. It was the perfect place to end a nightmare. He stepped out of his car slowly. His hands were empty. No gun, no radio, no backup. Just the steady sound of his footsteps echoing across cracked concrete as he approached a warehouse with a single open door. Inside, it was cold, too dark to see far, too still to feel safe. Then a faint sound broke the silence. A cough, a muffled cry. Harris's heart tightened. He moved toward the sound, and as he stepped into a dimly lit corner, he saw them. The person the killer had taken, tied to a chair, weak, but alive. "Hold on," Harris whispered, kneeling down. "You're safe now. I'm getting you out." But before he could cut the ropes, a voice emerged from the shadows behind him. Calm, clear, almost amused. "Safe?" Harris didn't turn. He already knew. The killer stepped into the thin strip of light, smiling like he was greeting an old friend. "You followed instructions," he said. "Good. I knew you would." Harris stood slowly. "This ends tonight." The killer nodded. "Oh, it does. But not how you think." He raised a small device. A detonator, the same kind used in the earlier explosion. Harris froze. "One press," the killer said, "and this entire warehouse becomes a headline." For a moment, neither of them moved. The air felt thick enough to choke on. The kidnapped victim whimpered softly behind Harris, and that sound, fragile and terrified, gave Harris clarity. "You don't want to die," Harris said. "You want control. You want fear. You want attention. That's why you left clues. That's why you filmed everything. You wanted an audience. You can't stand the idea of ending this alone." For the first time, the killer's smile faded. Just a flicker, but enough. Harris pressed forward slowly, hands raised. "Put the detonator down. Walk out with me. You can face the court, the cameras, the world. You wanted an audience. You'll have one." The killer's breathing changed, shaky, uncertain. "You think you understand me?" he whispered. "I do," Harris said quietly, "but it stops here." The killer looked at the detonator, then at Harris, then back again. His hand trembled. A long second passed, and finally, he dropped it. The small device clattered to the floor. Harris lunged instantly, kicking it away and tackling the killer to the ground. Officers burst in seconds later, because Harris knew the chief would send backup, even if he didn't ask. The killer was handcuffed, dragged out screaming, his voice echoing inside the empty warehouse. "This isn't over. You can't erase me." But it was over. For the first time in weeks, the city breathed again. Harris untied the victim, holding them as they sobbed into his shoulder. The nightmare that held the city hostage finally collapsed, and all that was left was relief, exhaustion, and a quiet understanding that justice, real justice, wasn't always clean. Sometimes it was bruised, bleeding, and barely standing, but it stood. As morning light broke across the skyline, Detective Harris stepped outside, watching paramedics care for the victim and officers load the killer into a transport vehicle. And for the first time, the air didn't feel heavy. Case closed, city safe, nightmare ended. But the documentary ends with one final reminder. Sometimes monsters look like strangers, sometimes they look like neighbors, and sometimes they stand so close you don't see them until it's almost too late.